Welcome everybody to the final week of February Flare Up 2026. I'm Karen and I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 encompasses the traditional lands of many Indigenous peoples. I like to note that land acknowledgements are wonderful, but it's important to think about reconciliation. And that's an ongoing process. It requires learning, reflection, and action and the building and maintaining of respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So as I said, I'm Karen. I'm the General Manager at Canada Wildfire, and I'm really happy to have you all here with us today. It's our final week of February Flare Up. We've spent the last 3 weeks looking at the NSERC Canada Wildfire Strategic Network and highlighting some of the many projects that came out of this initiative. So this week, I'm really excited to have 3 researchers here with us from the University of Toronto. They're all part of the James Lab, and they're going to be talking to us about insect disturbance and fire. So first up, I have Kennedy Korkola. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the James Lab, and she's going to be talking to us about wildfire containment probability and how it is or is not affected by eastern spruce budworm defoliation in Ontario. So welcome, Kennedy. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah,
All right, I'll
so
hand it off to you.
sure, perfect. So like Karen said, my name is Kennedy Korkola, and I'm a PhD candidate in the James Lab and Wildfire Analytics Lab. And I'm wrapping up my thesis right now. But today I'm just going to present on some of the earlier work that I was doing when I started my PhD, and that's on wildfire containment probability. And I was looking at, what the drivers of that are and whether it was affected by spruce budworm defoliation. So the boreal forest is the most extensive forest type that we have in Canada, and it is shaped by landscape disturbances. Disturbances are important for nutrient cycling and stand regeneration, and they're natural processes that influence landscape pattern. And so 2 important disturbances that we have in our boreal forests are insect outbreaks as well as forest fires. And we can see from these 2 figures here that both of these disturbances, the one on the left is an eastern spruce budworm, and that's just showing, these are across Canada that this disturbance is taking place with a heavy focus kind of in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And then, of course, we have wildfires, as everyone knows, and these, of course, are widespread across our boreal forests. And as we can see, we have very similar spatial extents for these disturbances. And so sometimes we get interactions, and these interactions occur through the alteration of forest stand structure. But what's concerning is both of these disturbances are becoming increasingly altered due to climate change, and we lack knowledge on the consequences of their interactions and what that's going to mean for ecosystem resilience, as well as fire management capabilities. So we're going to zoom in into Ontario. That's where most of my work is focused. And we're going to be talking more specifically, of the eastern spruce budworm, which is a native defoliating insect that attacks and kills balsam fir and spruce species across Ontario. Outbreaks occur every 30 to 40 years and can last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Stand mortality can occur after 4 years of cumulative defoliation, but changes to that fuel structure, that fuel complex, can continue up to 16 years after an outbreak has taken place. And what's concerning is these changes to fuel structure can then influence subsequent disturbances such as wildfires. And, we have considerable spatial overlap of these 2 disturbances. So what is that going to mean when they do inevitably interact with each other? So fire behavior is influenced by 3 primary things, and that's weather, topography, and fuels. And my thesis is focusing on this fuels component of fire behavior, and specifically how the eastern spruce budworm changes forest structure to affect fire behavior and fire outcomes, such as containment probability, as well as area burned. So this is a figure from Graham Watt in 2018. And this is just looking at, how spruce budworm is affecting the forest. And so if we see closer on the left, this is a healthy, intact forest. And then as we move over to the right, that's where we see more effects of defoliation. And this is because defoliation doesn't necessarily result in mortality right away. It does take time for these structural characteristics to emerge. And so what's happening is budworm begins feeding at the tops of trees and causes top kill. As a result of that, we get increased crown breakage, and we can kind of see in our diagram here that, the crowns of the trees are becoming dead. Those are falling off after wind throw events, and what's expected is we're getting an increase in the amount of surface fuels, but we're also getting an increase in ladder fuels or fuel continuity. And this can be a problem because we might be getting increased surface fire intensity, and we might be lowering the canopy base height, so more continuous fuel path. And this might be allowing fires that would otherwise be maybe a slower moving surface fire to transition into that high intensity crown fire that's going to become much more difficult for fire management agencies to deal with. And so this change, where fire risk or fire potential in this case is expected to be at the greatest, is at this window of opportunity. And this is around 5 to 10 years since mortality. And, it's been proposed that crown breakage is going to be the main driver affecting this, changing fuel loads and that fuel continuity. And so what I wanted to know was whether or not this increase in fire risk, fire potential, was going to have any impact on fire suppression capabilities or initial attack. So initial attack is the initial action taken to limit or stop the spread of a wildfire. So successful containment is occurring when a fire is no longer expected to grow, typically due to, we know the forecasted conditions and we have adequate resources on that fire. In Ontario, this would be abbreviated as BHE, other provinces as BH, and this is just the being held stage. So we don't expect fires to grow past this. Previous work has suggested that fuels and weather are affecting initial attack success. So things like the size of the fire when we arrive at initial attack, the fire spread rates or other fire behavior metrics, and crew response time to those fires can be affecting successful containment, but also fuel load, resources, and the weather conditions when we're doing initial attack. And so spruce budworm has been hypothesized and in some studies shown to change fuel structural characteristics or the fuel complex. And so this could be more difficult for firefighters to lay hose in these stands if we have all this blowdown and increased fuel on the ground and wrap the fire. But we also might be seeing altered fire behavior, such as changes to intensity and spread rates, which could make it more difficult for crews to contain fires. So my two primary objectives or questions were, what are the main drivers of wildfire containment in Ontario? And does the inclusion of spruce budworm defoliation history improve these current models of containment? So what I did was I created two random forest models. So random forest is just a machine learning method where we're going to take multiple decision trees and we're going to get the majority voting. And it's just a more robust way of a decision tree, essentially. And so my predictors were the fire weather indices, the size of the fire at initial attack, the ecoregion, was it in the western part of Ontario or the eastern part of Ontario? And then one model was built like this, and this was the null model. And the second model included time since defoliation as one of the predictors. And then I was modeling whether or not the fire was BHE by 1300s the following burning period. So was the fire contained, essentially? And then I compared these two models based on model accuracy and a few other different metrics. So what we found was the main driver of initial attack success is the size of the fire at initial attack. So what is the size of the fire when crews first arrive? Larger fires, those are going to require longer hose lays, more resources. They might have fire behavior that's maybe contributing to faster spread anyways. The next most important variables were the fire weather indices, so FWI, ISI, BUI, DMC, and FFMC. So size at IA was the most important variable for predicting successful containment. And we can see this is a partial dependence plot, and it's just showing that, the probability of containment, based on our definition, very sharply declines with increasing size at initial attack. And we can kind of look at the differences in these fires. So the average fire size at initial attack for a contained fire was 0.6 hectares, whereas for an escaped fire, it was 7.2 hectares. So big size difference that would, predict if a fire was going to be escaping our threshold of containment. What we're also curious about, though, is, if size at IA is driving containment, perhaps budworm is affecting the conditions for that size at initial attack. So budworm has been shown in the past to increase the probability of ignition. And so we wanted to look a little bit more into that, maybe if we scale down and look a little finer. But when we looked at the main drivers of size at IA, which is super messy to look at, weather indices are the main thing that are going to be driving that initial fire size and the response time of those crews. So what about time since defoliation? Time since defoliation across all of our models ended up being the lowest important variable. And when we compared these two models in terms of these different accuracy metrics, what we found was there really was no statistical significant difference between these two. There was a slight significance difference between the area under the receiver operator curve, suggesting maybe including budworm increased our ability to distinguish success from failure. But generally speaking, both models performed really well, and budworm did not significantly improve that. And what we see from our partial dependence plot here, even if it is not really significant, as time since defoliation increases, there is a very slight decrease in the probability of containment. So defoliation history did not drastically improve model performance, which is not what we expected. Size at IA was the most important variable, followed by fire weather. And defoliation played this minimal role. And so what we think might have happened is that this metric of containment, of initial attack success, is not actually capturing fire behavior. It's capturing this human-created definition of containment. So, we're not actually looking at, was the fire difficult to control because of spread rates, or because of intensity, or because of those fuel loads. We're just looking at this outcome instead. Also, one of the things is that canopy fuel loads are actually really decreased in defoliated areas due to that increase in crown breakage. And so we might not actually be getting these high intensity crown fires that have been suggested. And the surface fuels from these broken crowns could be too large to be contributing to those really fast rates of spread that occur in those really fine fuels. So also defoliation, while affecting ignitions, it might have less influence immediately after that fire spread. And that could just be due to, what I said earlier, canopy and surface fuel changes. Some evidence suggested that defoliation occurring at time legs greater than 8 years had slightly lower containment likelihoods than earlier defoliation, but again, this wasn't very significant. So what's next? Some of my other work has looked at scaling out. So I'm working on a paper right now looking at the amount of area burned in defoliated areas. And just generally as well, we found that in areas with defoliation, you see in these categories here, we see less area burn than what we would expect based on how much fuel of that defoliation class is on the landscape. Again, maybe reinforcing that defoliation is, again, maybe it's affecting ignitions, but it's not affecting these things afterwards because of these reductions in canopy fuels. I also went and did a bunch of field work in defoliated stands to look at maybe gaining a better mechanistic understanding. And again, what we kind of find is that, there is increased tree mortality, there is increased crown breakage, but canopy bulk density is decreasing a significant amount in defoliated areas. And this canopy bulk density is a really important fuel metric that's needed for crown fires and crown fire spread. And we're not seeing that in these defoliated areas. So The interaction between defoliation and wildfire behavior is not fully understood, and we lack knowledge on the consequences of these interactions in terms of resilience and for fire management agencies. But what's tricky is this isn't a very simple relationship. This relationship also includes all these other aspects. So spruce budworm defoliation can be measured in multiple different ways. And then how is that defoliation affecting the fuels, like the fuel load and the connectivity? But then what does that mean for fire behavior? And how is that changing intensity and spread and transition, like fire transition? And then we can get to containment and area burned. And what makes this more complicated is there's this spatial temporal component where defoliation and fire are operating maybe on slightly different frequencies, but also, defoliation is changing this relationship with the amount of cumulative time since and intensity. Thank you for listening to my talk. My email is there and the labs that I'm a part of. And if you'd like to read more about this paper, I just have it down here.
Awesome job, Kennedy. Really interesting study. And I know personally when I read your title, I had to read it a few times to be like, it's not affected. No, it's not. Like I had to almost convince myself because I think I had an assumption that it would be.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
there's
you
an
did a one.
overwhelming amount of literature that talks about, defoliation does have this effect, but like we weren't able to detect it in these in initial attack at least.
Yeah, and I think you did a really good job laying out maybe why that might be, and that's not just showing up in the fire behavior metrics, which I know there's questions in the chat box, but I have a question first. And I was wondering if maybe it is affecting it, but not being captured in the sense of, I got to read my like arrows I got going on here. You talked about how spruce budworm defoliation is increasing the probability of ignitions. And so I'm just thinking of this just seems like a lot of confounding factors here, right? And so if it's increasing the probability of ignitions, then it could be affecting containment success by stretching resources more, decreasing the ability of IA resources to get there faster, increasing the size of fire at IA. So like we might be seeing it almost as like a precursor in some ways, right? Which is kind of neat to
Hmm.
think about.
Yeah, and I didn't show it, I think, in there, but response time didn't end up being very significant in my models. And it could
Okay.
be the way that we had it stratified by only looking at lightning fires. And so, those might have longer response time. Season also didn't end up being very significant in our models either. The main thing was size and initial attack, which was actually influenced a bit by the response time. So yeah, they're all in there in some way or another. Um, but yeah, it's
Got it.
not changing the containment difficulty essentially.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, so the first question in the chat box is what threshold did you use to define escaped fires?
So the threshold that we used was whether or not the fire was considered BHE by 1300 the following burning period. And we chose that threshold because I was trying to isolate all of the different predictors and conditions to that ignition point, because that's where we had all of our data. Once we started moving outwards, and that would we started to lose precision in our data. And so if we were to choose maybe a size-based threshold, it might not have been as accurate. So I was trying to narrow it into that ignition point where we had available information. And Melanie Wheatley and I put out a paper as well comparing different initial attack definitions. And we found that they often are categorizing fires in a very similar way, no matter what definition you're going to be using.
Awesome. Thanks, Kennedy. And I missed it there, but classified as BHE by what time?
1300 the next day.
Okay, thank you. Which is slightly different depending on which area in Alberta you are, the threshold for being held,
Yeah,
and
and I know in
success.
Alberta there's a threshold for 2 hectares and for oh, I can't remember the 10
I
hundred
think it's
hours,
10
I think
a.m.
is
Yeah.
yeah, 10 a.m. and 2 hectares is used in Alberta pretty commonly.
Yeah. So great question from our participant that posted that. So it is important to note that there are regional differences in what being held, the definition of being held or contained. Um, if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Otherwise, I was curious if you have projects or ideas lined up for kind of next steps. I know you're at the tail end and so close to defending, graduating, having everything wrapped up, and I was curious if you can give us an insight into what might come next.
Yeah, I'm currently looking, for employment opportunities, postdocs, and most of my work, does disturbance ecology. But I think that there is a large gap in fire behavior and understanding this fuels fire behavior, and feedback of that in novel fuel types, which spruce budworm defoliation is the novel fuel type that I tend to work in. And so, yeah, it would be really interesting to do more work in fire behavior, um, and disturbance modeling.
Awesome. Thanks, Kennedy. Are you okay if I share your LinkedIn
Yeah.
connection in the chat? Okay, I'll put that there. So if anyone wants to connect with Kennedy, you now have a metric to do it. Thank you for your presentation and your wonderful answers to all of our questions. If you don't mind to stop sharing, and we'll get our next presenter, Jack, to start sharing his screen while he works on that. Oh boy, I have the 1,000 windows open. I gotta find the right one here. Okay, awesome. You're up there. Okay, so our next presenter is also from the University of Toronto, but he's kind of straddling two institutions right now. So Jack is a PhD candidate for a couple of more weeks, rolling into his defense right away, but he's also working as a postdoc at Carleton University. He's going to be talking to us about the impact of spruce budworm defoliation legacies on wildfire burn severity and post-fire recovery. Welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Karen. And thanks, Kennedy, for getting a lot of the background and spruce budworm out of the way. So I can kind of get going here. So I'll be talking to you today about some of the work I did during my PhD, specifically looking at the effect of spruce budworm defoliation legacies on wildfire burn severity and post-fire recovery. So the amount of days conducive to high severity fire is increasing across the boreal forest. This map from Wagedal in 2025 shows the difference in the estimated high burn severity days in 2023, compare with a 40-year mean. These percentiles describe where the 2023 value sits within the distribution of the past 30 years. So you can see white sits within the mean, whereas the yellow to red indicates increasing extremes away from the mean. So this apparent increase in burn severity, or the amount of days conducive to high severity fire, is important because burn severity is crucial to forest ecosystem structure and function. So that is, it is described as the degree of ecological change caused by fire, and it has a significant impact on forest resilience. So here we have two images taken from the same fire that burned in Wabakimi Provincial Park, which is just near Thunder Bay in Western Ontario in 2013. See on the left, we have a high severity burn patch, and on the right, we have a low severity burn patch. So you can see there's a lot of difference between these two areas, which can have, as I said again, a significant influence on ecosystem resilience. Now, what do I mean by ecosystem resilience? Well, that is the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance and persist without shifting into a different state or losing its essential functions. And ecosystem resilience is an important concept as to how we conceptualize our forests. And when we look at these high severity fire, again, this is an example of a high severity fire on our left versus a low severity fire. These high severity fires consume seed banks, organic layers, leaving poor seedbed relative to the low severity fires. And as years pass following these wildfires, we see that due to these changes in the high severity fire, we can sometimes see a low conifer regeneration and even shifts from coniferous to some mixed or more deciduous stands. So going back to this paper by the same study by Wang et al., they also looked at the dominant drivers of burn severity across 10 ecozones, Canadian ecozones. And in 5 of these 10 ecozones, it found that fuel was either the most dominant or most foremost driver. And when thinking about fuel, especially in the Eastern Boreal Shield, this is increasingly important because there's a big question surrounding fuels in this area that was previously talked about by Kennedy, which is that there is an uncertainty in how these insect-affected fuels will influence wildfire. So just without going too much into the detail about spruce budworm that we saw previous, so spruce budworm in this area is actually the most widespread natural disturbance. So this is a time lapse you see on the right here of spruce budworm outbreak from 2006 to 2024. And this affected a large amount of area, culminating in almost 6.6 million hectares defoliated in 2024 alone. Now, as Kenny mentioned, this increases the likelihood that wildfires will burn in budworm affected areas. Now, this is important because previously, since around the 1920s, it has been hypothesized that we're going to see this increased fire hazard in post spruce budworm affected stands, because this is again due to the fuel accumulation following defoliation and increase of fire risk through vertical fuel continuity. And this is kind of a good comparison that I like to think about or to look at. And this is a representative photographs of fuel distribution in stands dominated by spruce budworm host. So A is a healthy stand with no defoliation. B is an unhealthy stand following sustained spruce budworm defoliation. And it's important to note, as the years since defoliation passes, we tend to see this stand breakdown and the change in fuel structure, which could have important consequences for wildfire outcomes. And this hazard, or peak crown fire hazard, is generally around 5 to 8 years post-outbreak. Previously in Ontario, studies have shown that fire risk is increased in these defoliated areas. But when we think about wildfire outcomes like burn severity and post-fire recovery, there's relatively little evidence as to the consequences of spruce budworm on wildfire and these outcomes. The only evidence that we have so far is actually in another defoliated system, which is the Western spruce budworm, where they showed that actually severity is reduced following in fires following outbreak. So this presents us with kind of a few avenues to explore. First, in main, is the uncertainty around the effect of spruce budworm legacies on wildfire outcomes. And the second is there are some challenges with understanding defoliation effects, especially due to these defoliation events are generally mapped using large-scale aerial sketch map data. There's a lot of potential for confounding variables when trying to model this. So there needs to be kind of or maybe a benefit of exploring some methods to help isolate the effect from defoliation. So this is kind of what I set out to do, and hopefully to answer was, first, what is, or can we quantify or can we understand the effect of spruce budworm defoliation on wildfire burn severity, and to assess how defoliation influences post-fire recovery trajectories, and specifically how these effects vary across the time lag since defoliation. So as that fuel begins to change following defoliation, and whether we can isolate the impacts of defoliation from other potential confounders. So my study area looked at the Ontario's Boreal Shield region, I specifically looked at wildfires from 1990 to 2012. The reason we ended in 2012 is because we wanted to get about 10 years post-fire of to monitor spectral recovery, and I'll get into that a bit later. We looked at both defoliated and non-defoliated fires. Our defoliated fires were fires where 90% of the fire area burned within or overlapped with spruce budworm defoliation that was recorded in either the year of the fire or 15 years previous, up to 15 years previous. And we ended up with about 837 fires that burned throughout this region, as you can see here on the right hand. So our first variable of interest was burn severity. So to measure burn severity, we used a remotely sensed measure of burn severity called RBR. We can do this because healthy vegetation reflects higher in the near infrared range, whereas burn vegetation reflects higher in the shortwave infrared range. So by taking the difference of these two ranges, we can measure the spectral reflectance of these burnt areas. So healthy vegetations showing high, what we call normalized burn ratio values, and burnt areas showing lower values. And then we can get two images, so a pre-fire and post-fire image, and look at the difference of, so how much did the fire influence the landscape. And then importantly, because we're looking at pre-fire affected fuels, to correct for changes in baseline reflectance due to pre-fire insect defoliation, we calculated a relativized metric, which corrects for any changes that may be due to pre-fire fuel changes. And then we get these maps, these burn severity maps, whereas the darker values indicate either unburned or low severity areas. And as we get brighter, we get to the more high severity areas. So the more, and then using this, we calculated the median for within every fire as a unit of analysis. Then for the other variable of interest was recovery magnitude. So recovery magnitude is how much a forest resembles its pre-fire conditions 10 years after the fire. And we used a spectral recovery index to measure this. This is by taking a pre-fire normalized burn ratio value subtracted by the fire year, and then taking the value 10 years following the fire and subtracting that from the fire year, and getting a difference between the two to see how much that fire, or how much that spectral index recovered to its pre-fire value. And we expect that increasing severity will prolong this recovery time, especially in defoliated areas. And these spectral recovery rates have been used to measure recovery before, but obviously some caution is needed, and we'll discuss some more of that later on. So so first off, we split our data into two subsets. So we have a burn severity subset and a recovery magnitude subset. In these two areas, each unit of analysis is an individual fire, where median burn severity and average recovery, median severity throughout an individual fire, and average recovery for each fire. Now, to isolate the impact of defoliation, what we did is we conducted something called a propensity score matching, where we found fires with similar covariates or confounders, and we matched those. So then we're comparing fires against one which has similar host species percentage, experienced similar fire weather, has similar topography. And then we calculated the average treatment effect on the treated, which is an average difference in outcomes between a group that receives a treatment, in this case, the treatment being defoliation, and a group that does not, across the entire population. So when we think about burn severity, what we actually found was that burn severity was overall higher in defoliated areas compared to non-defoliated areas. However, we found that depending on the time that passed between the defoliation event, and when the fire burned, we saw some differences. So specifically in the immediate, or we call it the early lag period following fire, we found a significant effect of defoliation on burn severity. Again, also in these late lags, which are, we call it 10 to 15 years following spruce budworm outbreak. But in this intermediate period, we found no significant difference between defoliated and non-defoliated fires. And it's important to remember that these fuel conditions are changing the longer it's been since the forest was defoliated. Now, when we think about forest recovery, overall, we found that defoliation increased post-fire recovery by about 19% compared to non-defoliated fires. And again, we found this difference based on the time since defoliation. So we found, again, a significant impact in the early periods and a significant impact in the later 10 to 15 year periods. But we also found in the 69 and in one intermediate period that there was something going on here where we found recovery was faster and significantly stronger in defoliated compared to non-defoliated areas. So what does this mean? Well, for specifically when thinking about severity and why it might be higher at these early and late lags, I really like this image here, which is a panel and shows representative photographs of 4 zones of spruce budworm defoliation within a boreal mixedwood forest near Warren, Ontario. The defoliation zones A through D are regions with different years of continuous spruce budworm defoliation, or following defoliation, sorry. So we have in the immediate periods of immediate period, so around 0 to 2 years following defoliation. B is around 4 years following defoliation. C around 8 to 9 years, and then D around 15 years. So we see in these early lags, it could be that frost buildup and surface fuels could create conditions more conducive to some high severity fires. But in these intermediate periods where we saw no significant difference between defoliated and non-defoliated areas, we have this regrowth, or this more live understory vegetation, which may increase fuel moisture, lowering flammability. And then in these late lags, we have these larger structural changes. So large inputs of coarse woody debris, snags begin to fall, branches begin to shed into the understory, then creating conditions that would presumably be conducive to more high severity fires. Now, when we switch over to look at recovery trajectories, I really like this figure, which kind of encapsulates what we mean by these spectral recovery trajectories. So this is the average normalized burn ratio on the left, and these are the years in our time series. So 1 would be the year prior to fire, 2 is the year of fire, and 13 would be 10 years following the year after fire. So what we see here is that the defoliated, the red dots, and see they recover back to their pre-fire value by that 10-year mark, whereas the non-defoliated stands do not. So initially, you look at this and say to yourself, oh wow, that's we looked at it and said that's pretty cool. That shows that maybe there is the interacting effects of spruce budworm and fire. Maybe there's some resilience at play, or some interesting feedbacks. But this can also be interpreted into a negative context, where maybe these faster recovery rates could indicate species shifts, so maybe more faster growing deciduous species. However, it's also important to be skeptical with these spectral recovery trajectories, because since they are just spectral indices, we don't know what's actually occurring on the ground. We're trying to infer to the best of our ability. So these spectral recovery rates could also be capturing multiple vegetation types, for example, just an increase in shrub cover or grasses. So in the future, looking at what's actually happening on the ground is really important. But overall, the broader implications of this work is that I think what we've shown is that we've highlighted that temporal dynamics of insect fire interactions are really important, and maybe looking at just the overall impact, whether the presence absence of defoliation is not enough to actually tease apart some of these effects, and also suggests that maybe integrating these spatial legacies of spruce budworm defoliation into wildfire risk models is important, especially even if the event has occurred up to 15 years prior. And we've also teased at the value of propensity score matching to isolate main effects in these observational studies, where it's important to control for potential confounders. And in the future, what we'd like to do is to go to the field and validate some of these spectral recovery metrics with field data, and maybe investigate some other indices as well, and even some other defoliator systems to see how these relationships change and play out in other systems, such as the Jack pine budworm, which Léo will be talking to you all about shortly. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to my collaborators, Dr. Patrick James and Marie-Josée Forte, and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Jack. That was great. I love learning new things, and both you and Kennedy had me madly Googling during your presentation. So to me, that's always a sign of learning something new and exciting and great. And I have to say, frass is not a term I was familiar with. I don't know if I don't know if there's anyone else on this call that learned a new word today, but did you want to provide a bit of a explanation for that one for people?
Yeah, so it's loosely a term related to excretions and kind of residue left over from the insects as they defoliate the stand. So predominantly in this case, I'm referring to the leftover food residue, so needles and pines left on the ground.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm not an insect person, so I'll preface this with, I changed my undergrad when I found out how many entomology classes I had to take in my past program. And so I also had to Google the difference between Western and Eastern spruce budworm, which was very enlightening and also very intuitive. Just different trees, distinct species. But yeah, thank you for that. If anyone has any questions for Jack, please feel free to post them in the chat box. In the meantime, I have a couple here, but yeah, my first one was when you talked about recovery magnitude. I was curious. So we're looking at spectral signatures, right, of like healthy vegetation to measure that metric. This is a metric that's obviously been published and been used a lot, but I was looking for a bit more understanding around how successional stages might impact that metric.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So that was, the issue with the spectral signatures, as I kind of brought up, is that we're just measuring the greenness. So, at when grass comes up at early successional stages, or you start getting that increasing in herbaceous shrub cover, it's going to seem like things are growing really fast and everything's okay. But I think there's some evidence out there that depending on the spectral indices you use, you could actually pick up more of the structural changes that are important. So right now we're simply picking up these the greenness of the area, but some with the successional trajectories, you're going to see differences in the structure that play out. So maybe using some more hyperspectral imaging or some different components, maybe even with LIDAR, to try to tease apart whether there are some structural characteristics that we're not capturing, which would then be what I believe would be inferred by those successional trajectories.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think in my mind, when I think of, how similar is it to pre-fire, I right away go to like being in that stand and the species, the composition, the structure and everything. So it's good to like remind that, no, we're looking at this as a metric, right? The greenness. So Awesome, thank you. There is a question in the chat asking if anyone in the group has checked the ignition probability difference with or without defoliation.
Yeah, so a lot of this intrigue, I believe, in our group comes from our supervisor, Dr. Patrick James, who in 2017 published a paper, Movies and Ecological Applications, where they looked at wildfire likelihood in defoliated versus the non-defoliated areas. And they found that why the likelihood, or so his ignition probability, increased in defoliated areas. And this was across both areas in the western portion and the eastern portion of Ontario's boreal shield. So believe, if I remember off the top of my head, it was Abitibi and believe Lake Nipigon. Someone can correct me, or Lake St. Joseph if I'm wrong. But yeah, so people have looked at that before.
Thank you. And a note of thank you. Great answer and great job. There's another question here asking if you've compared burn severity between early spring, so pre-green up fires, and later summer fires.
So that's a great question. And it's actually something that we've started to look at a little bit more just following this work. Most in this area, there's not a lot of spring fires actually. So for reference, I was in another chapter, I was looking at over 1,000 fires that burned in the boreal shield of Ontario. And there were only about 87 fires, which burned within our definition of the spring window. So the boreal shield of Ontario is mostly driven by in summer fires are more common. But in maybe some other regions, that would be a really interesting question to look at. And it's something I've started to go back and think about a bit more in my work as well, but it wasn't explicitly tested yet.
Thank you, Jack. I do have a question for me in the chat, just asking when the recording will be available. I will do my best to get it up early next week, kind of Monday or Tuesday. And so it'll be on Canada Wildfire, or sorry, youtube.com/Canada Wildfire. So if you subscribe, it should give you a notification once it's posted. I'll give it another few seconds here to see if there are any more questions. And while we wait for that, Jack, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll get Leo to load up his. Did you have any closing comments before we switch over?
Nope, that's it. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. All right, so we're going to hop into our final presentation for today. So we're going to have Leo with us. He's a research associate from the University of Toronto, also from the James Lab. He's going to be talking to us about the use of terrestrial lidar to evaluate gradual change in fuel structure following jack pine budworm outbreaks. So now we're switching from spruce to jack pine. Leo, welcome. I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Karen. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking today about my work that I did during my master's thesis with Dr. Patrick James in the James Lab. As Karen mentioned, I'm now a research associate in the lab. And so I've worked on using terrestrial lidar to evaluate fuels following jack pine budworm outbreaks. And so I'll jump right into it. I did want to mention that I think I've benefited greatly from the Canada Wildfire Network, and so just want to extend my gratitude there before I start. Okay. Right. So we heard from my colleagues about the spruce budworm. And another native defoliating insect is the jack pine budworm, and the extent to which the jack pine budworm, its range, kind of covers much of the boreal forest of Ontario. So the jack pine budworm and the spruce budworm, similar systems, but they have some key differences. And so for the jack pine budworm, we have cyclical eruptive outbreaks, and they tend to occur every 6 to 12 years, and they usually last 2 to 4 years. Now, Ontario actually had an outbreak that started in 2017 that affected over 3 million hectares. it's now largely subsided. So what happens during these defoliation events is large patches of forests are affected, which is what this image at the bottom right of the screen shows. So you see like these brownish patches. So that's a defoliated stand. Now that's what happens kind of at the stand level, but the mechanism that drives this is what happens at the individual jack pine budworm level, where the larvae feed on pollen cones and the buds of the host species, which is, of course, as the name suggests, jack pine. And so, the jack pine budworm defoliation usually doesn't cause mortality of healthy host trees. But when the defoliation is severe enough and occurs multiple years in a row, it can lead to top kill, which of course is when the top of the tree dies and then sometimes falls to the ground. It can also lead to stunted tree growth. And when really the defoliation is severe enough, or maybe the tree wasn't quite healthy to start with, we see death of the trees. So on the map here is a map of the large fires in Ontario since 1963, and on top of that in green is the recent jack pine budworm outbreak, so the one that started in 2017 I just mentioned. And as you can see, the spatial extent of both has quite a bit of overlap. And so similar story to the spruce budworm, we kind of expect to see an interaction between jack pine budworm and wildfires. But what's interesting is despite the scale of these outbreak phenomenons, right? Like you can see how much was covered in this 2017 outbreak. And despite the potential interaction with wildfire, we actually know very little about the impact of jack pine budworm outbreak on fuel structure and fire risk. And so that's kind of what I was aiming to start answering with my master's thesis. So I elected to answer these questions using terrestrial LiDAR data. Now, very quickly, LiDAR data, of course, is this laser scanning technology. It sends out laser beams and it calculates how much time it takes to bounce back into the sensor. And ultimately, it gives you these very cool 3D maps, of which I've rendered 3 here on this slide. These are 3 jack pine stands that we've scanned. Now, you might have seen my colleague Zach's talk earlier this month, in which he was also answering these questions of jack pine budworm effect on fuel structure. He used manual vegetation measurements. If you haven't seen it, you should go watch the recording. So you might have the natural question of, okay, so then why are you using terrestrial LiDAR data? And what I hope to show you is that terrestrial LiDAR data provides novel information that was inaccessible before we had these 3D maps, and that are actually quite exciting to use. So LiDAR data is quite complex, but there's a lot to gain from novel information, and that's kind of what I was hoping to get at with my data. So kind of to summarize, right, the research question I was answering in this chapter of my thesis is, how do jack pine budworm outbreaks change fuel structure through time, and start getting at what might these changes mean for fire behavior. So to answer this question, we've sampled areas across a space for time chronosequence of time since outbreak. So we've sampled areas near Dryden and then north of Red Lake in the White Feather Forest, which is just south of Pikangikum First Nation. We've sampled data in 2021, 2022, and 2024. The reason why we did a space for time chronosequence is to really capture as much of the temporal variation of fuel structure change with time since outbreak. So what we did is we did a multi-scan protocol using the next generation Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System fuel sampling protocol. And so we had control sites, and we had sites that had been impacted by jack pine budworm outbreaks and whose outbreak had ended between 1 to 5 years ago. So 1 to 5 years since outbreak end. So to kind of give you a quick detour into the processing of this LiDAR data, right? I've mentioned that terrestrial LiDAR data and LiDAR data in general is very complex, and so LiDAR is great at giving you so much information, but it's not necessarily amazing at first, initially at giving you understanding. And so that was kind of the problem I tried to tackle with the first chapter of my thesis, which I'll just tell you very briefly about. It's not the topic of this talk, but I thought you might find it interesting. So essentially, you have this very large data, and you use metrics to summarize it and give you information. And the issue that you run into is that there's many different metrics that are described in the literature. And so the problem that I had is, which one should I use when I'm looking at these jack pine stands? Which one will give me information about fuel structure that matters? So what I did is I generated over 7,500 synthetic jack pine forest stands, those synthetic terrestrial LiDAR data of jack pine forest stands with varying fuel structure attributes. And then I tested basically a big bank of metrics from the literature to see which was the subset that I should be using in this jack pine budworm study. And what I found was that there are 4 metrics that best capture the variability in fuel structure, which I'll tell you about in the following slides. And so these metrics, some of them are quite intuitive. Some of them are maybe a bit more abstract, and I'll try to kind of give you an intuition of what they mean. But aside from that intuition, what's really neat about having all this library of synthetic forest stands is that I can actually see in my synthetic data what a change in these metrics actually means for fuel structure. And so I'll be able to use that for my interpretation, which is quite handy. So here are the results. The first metric that I looked at on these jack pine budworm affected terrestrial LiDAR data scans is the scan-wide 1D effective number of layers. What this metric does is it essentially counts the number of layers in the stand, and it weighs each layer by its density. So essentially, it's weighing the layer by how much stuff is in it. And what we see here is, as time since outbreak end increases, we see a gradual and significant increase in the scan-wide 1D effective number of layers. The second metric, which kind of ties into this first one, is the coefficient of variation of the effective number of layers. And this is very similar. It's splitting the stand in columns and calculating this effective number of layers that I just mentioned. And it's kind of looking at how much that's changing across columns in the stand. And here we see a similar story. As the time since outbreak end increases, we're seeing this significant gradual increase in the effective number of layers. And so what these are telling us is that we're actually seeing more complexity in the canopy of the forest. And what I can tell you from the synthetic data is that they also imply less horizontal connectivity in the canopy. The third metric that I looked at is canopy ratio, perhaps a bit more intuitive. It's this measure of how much of the volume in the stand occurs towards the top. And here we actually see a significant gradual decrease in canopy ratio as time since outbreak end. So this is kind of suggesting that the volume of things in the forest is gradually moving towards the ground, which we expect from what we know about these defoliating insects. And specifically from the synthetic data, this actually implies an increase in surface and elevated fuels as the time since outbreak end increases. Finally, maybe the most intuitive of all, the fuel strata gap, right? This is it basically looks at the average distance between the understory elevated fuels and the base of the canopy across the entire stand. Here, the signal is not quite as clear, but still significant. We still see this increase in fuel strata gap as time since outbreak end, which implies a lower vertical connectivity in the stands as you increase time. So, you know, what I've shown in my thesis is that what these metrics end up meaning is that we see lower vertical connectivity in the canopy. Going to the canopy, lower horizontal connectivity in the canopy. So there's more gaps in the canopy. There's more complexity in the canopy. So it's the canopy is less uniform, which kind of tells us about maybe that there's more solar radiation that's getting to the surface. Maybe the wind is better able to penetrate under the canopy. And on its own, those canopy attributes might suggest lower likelihood of crown fire initiation, lower likelihood of crown fire spread, but actually, from what we see with this increase in surface fuel and elevated fuels that we observe, and also what my colleague Zach showed in his talk, is that what we see is this increase in surface fuels indicate a higher crowning potential with time since outbreak. And so fires are probably going to burn differently in these Jack budworm impacted stands. Now, of course, there's still many questions to answer with the interaction between Jack budworm and wildfires, and so maybe as a gentle heads up, if you get excited about these questions and you want to pursue maybe these questions as well, here are some of the challenges that we've faced as we were working on this. So the first thing is that our data for where Jack budworm outbreaks have happened, where defoliation has happened, comes from aerial defoliation survey data. And this data is extremely valuable, but it's not perfect. And I've chosen to show you this data from 2021, which is really a caricature of how bad it can be. Right, we see here these really straight lines in where we observe defoliation, and obviously, maybe these insects are not moving in straight lines through the province. So here, what we're actually seeing is an artifact of the flight path that the surveyors took. And 2021 was a particularly smoky year, and so maybe the surveyors weren't able to see as far out of the plane. Maybe they weren't able to fly as much as they intended to, and so we have this we have large gaps in where we have data. And so this is an issue for two things. First, when you're choosing a control site, well, okay, we know that where defoliation has been indicated on the map, we can be pretty confident that there has been defoliation there. But where defoliation has not been indicated on the map, well, that's either because there's in fact no defoliation, or maybe that's just that the surveying wasn't able to go over that area. And so finding a control site is complicated. And I think Jack talked a bit about the importance of cumulative defoliation. So as defoliation occurs multiple years over, and so that's also something we were interested in capturing. And so it's hard to know if you have one site where you see that there's been defoliation in, say, 2021. Well, because of the gappiness in this data, it's hard to know whether 2020 was also defoliated or not. And so that's also important. So for us, that meant that we had to be very, very careful about our site selection. Now, the other problem is that we have limited data through time, right? So I've shown you results from 5 years since outbreak end. And of course, we were just talking about spruce budworm, which where the data collection occurs much further after the outbreak end. And so we kind of have this gap now, right? We want to keep seeing what those trends are as we increase time. Because of this eruptive nature of the outbreak, well, actually, we need to do this now, right? So the 6, 7, 8 years since outbreak end, that's right now that we can go collect it. If we don't go collect it now, we'll have to wait until the next outbreak. Similarly, right now it's pretty much too late to get data for 1 or 2 years since outbreak end. So what that means for us is that we're gonna keep visiting the sites that we've been where we've been collecting data. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, I suppose, it depends, we'll have to shift a little bit what questions we're able to answer in some of those sites. First of all, we lost some of the sites to logging, so that made for some surprising days out collecting data where we arrived and it was a clear cut. So that's some sites that we've lost, unfortunately. And then our sites that were in the White Feather Forest ended up being burned by the Red 62 fire last summer. So that now, we have to shift a little bit what our priorities are here for those sites. And so I'd like to just end maybe on this Red 62 fire. So here, hopefully, okay, here's a video that somebody that was on the fire sent me a few days ago. So this is not my research. I'm just exploring these things. And here what you'll see is that the fire is transitioning to the crown of these jack pine stands. And what's interesting is that this video is taken at a time when there's very, very low wind speed. I believe it's something like 5 kilometers an hour, if I recall correctly. And so we actually, this fire ended up burning it really intensely, as this map on the top right shows you. And so I guess now I'm asking myself questions. My colleague Zach showed that as jack pine budworm outbreak, as time since outbreak increased, the wind threshold to go from a surface fire to a crown fire decreases. And so in these stands where there was jack pine budworm outbreak, but there was also severe drought, I'm wondering whether whether that's what we're seeing here in that video. And then, of course, the fact that this fire burned really intensely and was hard to contain ended up having really important human implications because it caused the evacuation of the Pikangikum First Nation that was just north of where the fire was burning. Okay, so just to look ahead a little bit to future research, right? So we need to keep collecting jack pine budworm data, specifically after 5 years since outbreak. With this Red 62 fire and other fires, we can start answering questions about the impact of jack pine budworm on fire severity and behavior, etc. And then what I'm quite excited about and what we're currently working on with Dr. Patrick James through a WRFI-funded LIDAR project is keep developing methods to assess fuel structures from LIDAR and tie that information to fire behavior. So with that, thank you for listening, and apologies for the technical difficulties, and glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Leo. And it's out of our control. Computers do what computers do. Internet does what internet does. You did a wonderful job recovering from that. I don't know if I would have recovered so well. So kudos to you. And I want to say all three of you are very comfortable, competent, and interesting presenters. So wonderful job to all three of you. That was a very interesting presentation. I again had to look up and research a few things, which is great. I see some questions coming in the chat. I'm going to be selfish and ask my questions first, if that's all right. And just so you know, Leo, there is a pop-up with a reminder telling you that you have a forestry assignment due.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Elaborate of that.
but on one of your slides, when you were talking about the 1D effective number of layers, I was just curious, how thick are those layers?
Oh,
Like,
that's
what's
a
the size
really
of them?
good question. Um, Now, okay. Oh, now we're going back into my master's work. I believe the way I've calculated that is 1 meter layers, and then I'm dividing the data in smaller chunks within those 1 meter layers.
Okay,
I reproduced was what was done in the paper that described this metric.
thank you. And then on slide 14, you were showing the vertical connectivity and how it's changing over time, which was really interesting. And I was kind of curious, did you look at it as a overall metric of connectivity within the whole stand, or was there anything done to like tease out connectivity in maybe the bottom third versus top 2/3 over time?
Yeah, that'd be a really interesting approach. What essentially what I did was because I had all this large synthetic data available, the those aspect of fuel structure were actually captured in those synthetic data. And so basically I was able to use those synthetic data to inform the interpretation here in the real world. So I didn't specifically look at these, 1/3, 2/3, or other choices of along those lines, but I can reasonably say that I'm capturing that canopy aspect when it comes to those metric results. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Leo. So there's a question in the chat asking if there are any plans to consider the effect of both the budworms together.
Whoa. Okay. Um, I guess that'd be so the host species are different, of course. And so it'd be interesting to see where which fires kind of overlap both of those systems. Um, this is a very interesting question, and I hadn't actually thought of that. I'd have to look at where there's overlap. There's also this timing to it. Um, I don't think we have that plan yet, but you might have just started something in there.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm curious too. I'm not terribly familiar with fuel typing in Ontario, being from Alberta myself. But it'd be interesting to kind of, I guess, question one would be what percent of the forested area is kind of a mixed stand between the host species,
Yeah.
right? How common is that? And exactly what you noted. Are those areas burning? And maybe that's another question.
And I just maybe to add on, or just to note that in this study we were really looking at really jack pine dominated stands. So in
Okay.
this data would not make sense for that study, but it would be an option probably for with another data protocol.
Awesome. Thanks, Leo. And my last thing I want to note was I really appreciated you sharing the challenges. And as soon as you popped up that figure looking at kind of those delineated lines of data, I was like, oh my. And so, yeah, thank you for being so open and forthright with the caveats and challenges. I think that's always a really important thing to note. But also it provides a lot of direction for improvement in the future, right?
Yeah. And all these datas are great. I'm so grateful that we have this aerial survey data. So otherwise I'm not sure we would have anything at all. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, if there are any last minute questions for any of our presenters, please feel free to post them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to thank our three presenters for coming here today and sharing their projects. There's such an amount of work that went into these three projects, and I'm just constantly impressed by all of our NSERC students, graduates, postdocs, and especially Patrick James Lab. What a tremendously productive group of wonderful people. So I'd like to say thank you to Kennedy, Jack, and Leo for coming and sharing so openly with everyone. And thank you to our audience for attending, sticking with us through technological issues and asking such great questions. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a wonderful weekend. And yeah, thank you again for participating in February Flare Up 2026 and learning more about the NSERC Canada Wildfire Strategic Network. Bye, everyone.